Shalom. Welcome to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein, and coming up just in a few minutes, we'll have Mark Levin, as the Executive Director of NCSJ, who'll talk to us about what's going on in Ukraine and more broadly about Jews in the former Soviet Union. Before we get to that part of the show, it's the world in 5 minutes. So lots of different things that are going on this week. We just returned from the APAC Policy Conference, American Israel Public Affairs Committee Policy Conference in Washington, D.C. This policy conference takes place at a time when basically the two major issues that were on the table are both mid-secret negotiations, which makes it really difficult for a lot of things to be discussed by the leading policy people who come to speak to the conference. So, for example, there are currently ongoing negotiations between the Western powers and the government of Iran concerning its nuclear program. But these are secret negotiations, so we don't know where they are. We don't know what's specifically going on. We do know that concessions have been made at a low level, at least at this point, that have allowed several $1 billion worth of Iranian assets to be used by Iran. There are concerns about allowing Iran access to more money and lightening up sanctions that took a good bit of time to put in place to begin with. So that was one issue that was on the table at the policy conference. Another issue that was on the table is the peace process and what the Obama administration is doing in its efforts, led by Secretary of State John Kerry, as he works with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas. Those negotiations are also taking place in secret. And so it's really difficult. It's been really difficult, I think, for people to come out and say what they meant. So the two major speeches that took place at the APAC Policy Conference, one given by Secretary of State Kerry and the other one by Prime Minister Netanyahu, neither one of them were as hard-hitting as they could possibly have been. Secretary Kerry certainly wanted to reassure the people in the conference and the Jewish community more broadly that the Obama administration will do everything it can to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. As I've pointed out on this show multiple times before, the Israeli goal in dealing with Iran is to prevent Iran from having the capability of acquiring a nuclear weapon. It's a different goal, and there's a much different timeline between the two nations' goals. Between Israel's goals regarding Iran and also the United States' goals regarding Iran. And that came up in the two speeches. So Benjamin Netanyahu focused on capability. Secretary Kerry focused on acquiring a weapon as such. Netanyahu's speech was very awkward, I thought, simply because he would go through his speech and he'd say, here's point one, point two, point three, and where you'd expect a conclusion, there was no conclusion because he didn't want to say what he meant. Quite possibly because he didn't want to offend the administration, quite possibly because he was literally told not to say what he meant because he didn't want to interfere with negotiations in either level. So those are both possible, but it was somewhat awkward. One of the major efforts at the policy conference was very clearly showcasing Israeli technologies. There were a number of technologies, security technologies and medical technologies that came out. One of the things that was interesting in Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech is that with the ongoing drought in California, Prime Minister Netanyahu said, you know what, we're water secure now. We have great desalination and irrigation technologies. Why don't we help California? So there are evidently ongoing negotiations between the nation of Israel, state of Israel, and California about water, or at least they'll start soon. APAC Policy Conference asked for lobbying efforts on 4 different issues, one of which was the strategic partnership, making Israel a major strategic partner and enabling all kinds of different things to follow because of that. There's a letter regarding Iran sanctions, that if the negotiations fail, sanctions will follow. There was asking our Congress people to support John Kerry in his peacemaking efforts and to support Israel and what it needs to do during the peacemaking efforts, and then asking for foreign aid to be passed so that Israel will receive the military assistance that it gets every year. Today, it was revealed that Israel seized a major shipment of Iranian arms that were coming from Syria through the Persian Gulf. They were supposed to dock at Port Sudan and then be smuggled into Gaza, Port Sudan being in Sudan, and that's been the traditional smuggling route into Gaza, Sudan into Gaza. And these weapons, according to the Israeli government, would have been game changers. They are mid-range weapons that would have allowed strikes from Gaza to Tel Aviv. Excuse me. Sometimes you just can't stop a sneeze, no matter what you do. And the United States had been tracking this shipment, and they basically said if Israel didn't seize them, they would. This would have caused major problems strategically in the region. Coming up shortly, we will hear details of the framework agreement at some point in the next few weeks, and we certainly will be talking about that. We're talking about the framework peace agreement, and that will be coming up soon. That's the week in 5 minutes, the world in 5 minutes. After our break, we will have Mark Levin of NCSJ joining us to talk about Eastern Europe, and particularly Ukraine and Crimea, with the news today that the Parliament of Crimea has declared its independence, right after this break.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
I'm Brian Leach, owner and general manager of Service Legends. I brought along a couple of the home comfort heroes.
Hi, I'm Tammy Wells.
I am Nick Wondershad.
I'm administrative manager
I'm the senior technician
from Service Legends.
It seems like every good thing, when you feel it to the bone that it's good, there's a lot of hard work put behind it. I don't think that you can fake it and have it turn out good.
You know, if we seem like, okay, that's just weird, it's just a furnace, why would you believe so deeply in a furnace? It's not just that, you know, we want to show the world that you can have good service.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be, it's your home.
You know, it's built into our daily trainings, it's built into our culture, that we're going to do whatever it takes to have each client say they love us, period.
That's why we spend all the hours in the training that we do. And if we guarantee it's going to be a good experience for you, or else it's free, what type of work do you think we're going to do?
There is a guarantee.
Temperature selection guarantee, fixed right or it's free guarantee, comfort guarantee, best value guarantee. All of these guarantees hold us accountable to ensuring that we exceed your expectations. And if for whatever reason we'd fail and we can't make it right, we guarantee all of those guarantees with a 100% money back guarantee.
I mean, if you don't think that your technician can fix it right, are you going to say that to a client? No.
You don't have to worry about having a technician come to your house.
We drug test, background check all of our team members. We put safe people in your home. Each and every one of our service techs, 400 hours a year in training.
You tell it the minute they walk in the door. They know what they're doing, they've done their homework, and they actually truly care about what you want.
Because at the end of the day, you're the person that makes sure I have a job.
They're going to be listening. They're going to want to know what your challenges are. Then they're going to come and give you options, and you get to choose.
If I'm there to help and I make it easy and painless, I did my job right that day.
Well, when it comes to your comfort, safety, and your family, you know, you don't necessarily go buy the most expensive, but you get the most bang for your buck.
Oh, it's worth it, because there's a lot of people that will find a way to get it to work right now and then leave and then come back, charge you again, and the cycle just repeats itself. So when I'm out there looking at the furnace, I want to find why it failed today. How can we change the part today with something that you're not going to have to worry about? Is it worth changing the part today? I mean, you can put a lot of money into a furnace. I can fix parts all day. There's good job security in that for me. But is it the right thing for you?
I get a lot of the phone calls of after the technicians are there. They're just in awe. They're like, wow, you guys are great. I mean, I don't even know what to say. You guys are great. Everything you did was perfect. It was great.
Keep going though. I like this.
Just give us a try. I'm going to take all the risk.
I've got the time to make this right. I've got the support to make it right.
Just check us out.
And if you don't see the value in what we do,
I mean, fixed right or it's free or 100% money back.
enough said.
Shalom. Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Dr. Ronald Bergman and Bergman Folkers Cosmetic Surgery and Spa. Before we move on. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein of the Jewish Federation of Greater Des Moines, and we are joined via Skype by Mark Levin of the NCSJ. Mark, it's wonderful to have you on the show with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So tell us a little bit about what NCSJ does.
Well, we were created in 1971 to help people get out of the Soviet Union. But there was a second part of our mandate that we really didn't focus much on, and that was to help those Jews who wanted to remain in the Soviet Union and try to lead a Jewish life. Well, today, we obviously have accomplished the first part of our mission, and over 1 million Russian-speaking Jews are living in Israel today and hundreds of thousands elsewhere. But for the last 20 years, we've focused on trying to help those who are building Jewish communities throughout the former Soviet Union. So we deal with issues related to xenophobia, extremism, anti-Semitism, restitution of communal property, and trying to build a strong relation between Israel and these, well, not new independent states, but the countries that once made up the former Soviet Union.
Hi, Mark. This is Mark in Des Moines. What's the infrastructure of NCSJ in Eastern Europe these days?
Well, we are headquartered in Washington. We have a vast network of contacts with local Jewish communities throughout all of the countries that once made up the Soviet Union, and we have outreach with many of the Eastern European countries.
So the countries that your organization deals with are basically the former Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union plus some?
Former Soviet Union and some in Eastern Europe. We like to say that we were an advocacy group. We remain an advocacy group. Much of the work that we do today helps support the work of Federation-supported organizations like JDC, the Jewish Agency, World Org, the different religious streams that now operate throughout the region.
Mark, what are some of the services provided by NCSJ in Eastern Europe and FSU itself?
Well, as I said, we are a political advocacy group, so we try to address the issues that the communities themselves are unable to, and to try to work with our international partners to make sure that they're able to provide the services that that are supported by the federations and others in the United States. So, for example, one organization in particular had a very difficult issue with registering in Ukraine and being charged excessive taxes. We were able to save this organization over $1 million that could then go to help their elderly clients. We deal with issues related to anti-Semitism, of which we spent a lot of time on in Ukraine these days.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Ukraine. Can you give us kind of an overview of what the history of the Jewish community is in Ukraine, certainly in recent years? But if you want, you can go back beyond that. Give us a brief overview of what the community's like.
Sure, I won't go back too far. It's a long and checkered history.
Yeah.
We in the last 20 years, not just in Ukraine, but throughout the region, official anti-Semitism has all but disappeared. What we've been dealing with in Ukraine and some of these other countries is popular anti-Semitism. And in some ways, it's more insidious and more dangerous because it's not something that is easily addressed. So, in Ukraine, over the years, we've dealt with far left-wing and far right-wing groups that have tried to make Jews a scapegoat. We've been fortunate because successive governments have been willing to work with us to try to either put these groups out of business or at least disabuse the overall Ukrainian population that their messages have any validity whatsoever.
So in dealing with Ukraine right now, and I've heard about anti-Semitism, certainly on the pro-Russian side, on the pro-Ukrainian side. What's going on with that? You're talking left and right anti-Semitism, but it seems like there's influence of both of them, perhaps even significant influence of both of them.
Well, let me start with the good news. The good news is that that there have only been a few anti-Semitic incidents since we'll call it a revolution, since Ukrainians took to the streets in November. Now, any incident of anti-Semitism has to be taken seriously, but given how fluid and how volatile the situation in Ukraine has been over the last few months, I think it is good news to be able to say that there isn't a pattern of blatant anti-Semitism in Ukraine today. We are looking at these isolated incidents very seriously. Unfortunately, it looks like they may have been instigated by groups from outside of Ukraine to try to inflame the situation even more. I can tell you that in our conversations with the interim government leadership, they understand our concerns. They have been in regular contact with the Jewish leadership in Ukraine, and it's my hope that the atmosphere will continue, and that we won't be dealing with a much more difficult situation for Jews today. The last thing we want is for Jews to become pawns in a larger political game.
Mark, can you give us some demographic information of the numbers we're talking about, and in terms of age distribution as well, especially in Ukraine?
Sure.
Thank you.
The estimate is anywhere from 200 to over 350,000 Jews throughout the entire Ukrainian territory. Now, in Crimea, where much of the volatility is taking place, the range is anywhere from 10 to 17,000. There is a significant elderly population that JDC, the Joint, is trying to address to try to help meet their needs. You have the Jewish Agency undertaking large-scale educational efforts, including overseeing birthright and other projects or programs that encourage travel to Israel. It is a very diverse Jewish population. Now, having said that, there is still so much more that can be done in Ukraine. We, the organized American Jewish community, have only scratched the surface in our outreach to this significant Jewish population in Ukraine.
250 to 300,000 people sounds like an awful lot of people. How we think of the Jewish communities in Europe, Eastern Europe, being decimated after the Holocaust. Are these people who were in Ukraine after World War II? Or are they people who came from Russia to Ukraine? How long has that population been there?
It's all of that and more. I mean, you have to remember that in Russia and Ukraine alone, prior to the large-scale emigration, Aliyah, to Israel, there was a Jewish population in the Soviet Union of almost 3 million people. So, and even today, even 20-some years after the implosion of the Soviet Union, there are people who are finding out that they have a Jewish background or a Jewish identity. And of course, these numbers reflect the various definitions of how we define someone's Jewish identity.
Let's talk a little bit about what happened today and what impact it may have on what you do and the security of Jews. The vote in the Crimean Parliament. Can you talk a little bit about that and what's going on there?
Sure. It's look, the Crimea has a significant Russian-speaking population. And again, I don't want to bore the audience with too much history, but it's important to remember that Nikita Khrushchev gave or returned the Crimea to Ukraine to celebrate the 300 years of cooperation between Russia and Ukraine in 1954. It's always been an area with a mixed identity. And the other thing to remember about the history of the area is that there's a group called the Crimean Tatars who Stalin forcibly exiled and were only allowed to return in significant numbers after the implosion of the Soviet Union. So it's always been an area of controversy. I have to say I'm a little surprised that the Russians are expediting the vote on whether Crimea should remain in Ukraine or not by moving it up 10 days. I was even surprised by today's vote, because you have to ask yourself, what is the end game? What does Russia want if, in fact, they annex Crimea? Because they know, after their experience in Georgia, that most of the world still doesn't recognize an independent South of Ossetia or Abkhazia, these two breakaway parts of Georgia, and the world certainly doesn't recognize their integration into a larger Russia. So it's mystifying as to what Russia's end game will be. Now, the impact on the Jews, as I said, the population range is anywhere from 10 to 17,000, and right now, there's concern, but there's concern about what the future holds for them, either as Ukrainians, Russians, or Crimeans. Fortunately, they haven't been made scapegoats in this ongoing political controversy.
I've seen articles in which the Russians are clearly trying to make the argument that the Ukrainian nationalists are allied with the Nazis and hate the Jews, and how can the Jews possibly support the pro-European forces here? I mean, meanwhile, I've seen articles written by the Jewish community in Ukraine saying, "Don't listen to the Russians." Can you talk a little bit about that? What the Russians are trying to do with this idea? I mean, I have my own ideas of what's going on, but what are your ideas?
Sure. Look, the Russians are trying to make a case to justify why their troops or non-troops have taken control of Crimea. The president of Russia, the foreign minister, and their UN ambassador have all talked about Nazis and anti-Semites controlling the government. That's not true. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not concerned, or we haven't expressed concern about some of the elements that make up this new interim government, and before that, the opposition. There is a strong right-wing presence that we have been following closely, and we're concerned about. However, and this is important, is that there are not pogroms taking place. No one of legitimacy is calling for the evacuation of the Jewish community in Ukraine. And the problem and the challenge is not to allow these misperceptions to color the fact that we have been dealing with the issue of anti-Semitism in Ukraine for a very long time, and it shouldn't take away from the Jewish community's concern about making sure that there's adequate security for Jewish institutions throughout Ukraine. And what I'm afraid of is that these very serious concerns are getting lost in the political chatter. And it is highly irresponsible for particularly Jewish organizations to try to inflame the situation by describing an environment that just doesn't exist today in Ukraine.
And regarding that, I was kind of wondering, the Russian intent of this is to try to encourage the Jewish population to support the Russian takeover, or are we talking about just trying to discourage a very strong response in favor of the pro-European forces?
Well, I think it's a little of both. I think that they're trying to paint this picture of an extremist government that is not concerned about, and even more seriously, trying to hurt their religious and ethnic minorities. And that builds up a case for intervention, which is something that is just not supported by, I would say, a significant percentage of the Jewish community in Ukraine.
Mark, what can you tell us about Stavropol, and is there a major Jewish presence there?
There is a Jewish presence, and there is a synagogue. There is a strongly identifiable Jewish community, and it is a community that is not being targeted. It is a community that's concerned, but I think, as I said before, it's not only they have concerns about being Jewish, but they're also concerned about where what their future holds as a group living in Crimea. And it is a community that is well connected through JDC, the Jewish Agency, World Ort. There's an Orthodox and Reform presence there.
And the Reform synagogue was the one that was vandalized. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
How easy is it for people to move around the territory there, either by airplane or by train?
Well, it's interesting. I think, you've seen the pictures that we all have, that, you have these, well, I don't know what, the Russians call them, a non-military force, standing guard at major transportation centers, government buildings, but it seems as if day-to-day life is going along very normally. People are using the rail system. People are driving. The airport remains open. I think the biggest concern that many have in Crimea today is what's going to happen with their financial institutions, because there's some question about, whether normal transactions will continue given the crisis that exists.
Now, I think there was an issue about people's money being transferred into rubles or something along those lines, which also probably wouldn't be very popular as a thing to have happen.
Well, it's one more step in the annexation of Crimea.
Mark, what about what's the standard of living like for the Jewish population in Ukraine as compared to the general population?
Well, it mirrors the general population. It runs from from those who are very poor and need a great deal of help to the very wealthy. I mean, many of the Ukrainian oligarchs are Jewish, are actively engaged in the Jewish community, and it's everything in between. You have from the very old to the very young, but it also reflects the general population. Russia, Ukraine, the other Slavic countries, they all have very low birth rates and and higher death rates. It's there is a demographic challenge in the region, and the Jewish community reflects the larger population in that regard as well.
What are the status of Jews in some of the other countries? What's going on in the Baltics, for example, and in southern nations, Georgia and Azerbaijan, places like that? Our audience probably doesn't know much about Eastern European Jewry at this point at all. So what can you tell us is going on?
I'm glad you asked, because I don't think our American Jewish community here understands that the third largest Jewish community in the world is in the former Soviet Union. We're still talking about probably over 1 million people spread out through this entire region, with significant populations, not just in Ukraine, but in Russia, There are smaller populations in the 3 Baltic countries. There are Jews living throughout Central Asia and the Caucasus countries, the countries that most people, even today, probably don't focus on, like Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kazakhstan. I'd like to spend a minute talking about Georgia and Azerbaijan. I had the opportunity to take a leadership delegation there recently, and you're talking about an Orthodox country in Georgia where Jews have lived side by side with their neighbors with virtually no anti-Semitism for centuries. Jews, there's a small population of anywhere from 20 to 30,000 in Azerbaijan. It's a predominantly Muslim country, and again, not only is there very little anti-Semitism, Azerbaijan has become an important ally of both Israel and the United States. And if you look at a map, and I wish I had one with me, it's not such an easy decision because Azerbaijan sits between Russia on one side and Iran on the other. And they have gone out of their way to develop a diplomatic and commercial relationship with Israel. They've tried to be an important ally, as I said, to both the United States and Israel. And again, it's at a significant cost given who their neighbors are. There are Jews living, and I think this is very interesting. You have Jewish communities in Central Asia, which all of these countries are predominantly Muslim, and in Azerbaijan, and Jews and Muslims are getting along. When I hear about that Jews and Arabs or Muslims don't get along in the Middle East, and I say, well, it's not a Jewish Muslim issue, it's a Jewish Arab issue, because I can show you several countries where Jews and Muslims have coexisted for centuries and continue to. And again, in all of these countries, there are international Jewish groups operating, for the most part, with the support of the government and little difficulty. When they do have problems, they come to us and we try to help resolve those. But I would I would urge that that those in the audience who want to visit countries where Jews are trying to build a new community, then visit these countries in Central Asia and the Caucasus and see what's happening, see the exciting developments that are taking place.
Mark, what is the status of internet usage within these countries and access by the Jewish community to those resources?
It varies from country to country, and it really is a generational issue. Those living in urban areas tend to have greater access to the internet, are better connected. Those in their teens, 20s, 30s tend to also be more connected. And what's interesting, it's the younger generation, Jewish or otherwise, that's leading the change in so many of these countries. I mean, I think what happened in Ukraine will not be unique in the next 10 to 20 years, because when people are connected through the internet and they see how much of the rest of the world is living and is able to express their freedom in a way that's alien right now to many in this part of the world, it makes them want to be a part of this. I think this is one of President Putin's great misunderstandings. He believes that if you take care of the economic conditions, then people won't focus on political issues. And that's just not the case anymore, because as their economic condition improves, they want a fuller, richer life across the board. And I think you're going to continue to see, this younger generation in the vanguard pushing for dramatic changes throughout the region.
Where do you see as places where that is particularly the case? Where is it the case that you see kind of this revolutionary kind of attitude going on right now?
Well, it's developing in Russia, much to the consternation of the Russian government. And the Russian government may control television, radio, and more publications, but they haven't yet seized control of the internet like the Chinese have. So things are percolating in Russia. They're happening, whether it's in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. These are countries in the Central Asian region. It's what led to the dramatic changes in Moldova and helped bring in a new government in Georgia. And who knows what's going to happen in Belarus in the future. But even as isolated as that country may be, it won't be for much longer.
So I think for a lot of our audience, you're talking Chinese. What happened in Moldova?
I'm sorry, too much inside baseball. In the last few years, the Moldova went from a government that was went from a government that was actually controlled by the old Communist Party to a much more open environment, and it happened because the population wanted a more open political system, wanted a more open economic system, wanted greater freedoms. And Moldova, because of this, because of their desire to move closer to Western Europe, to the United States, has paid a price in their relationship with Russia. And the Moldovans, they're a small, impoverished country that doesn't get much attention, but is in the middle of this ongoing change that I think will revolutionize the entire region.
Mark, what is the European Union doing in this particular crisis, and how is it interacting with anything?
Well, they have, to use an American expression, they have finally stepped up to the plate.
Wow!
After playing a secondary role in watching Ukraine go into chaos because of the Ukrainian government's decision not to sign an agreement with the EU, the European Union is working today with the Americans to try to come up with an economic package that will help stabilize the Ukrainian economy and finally push the country forward. They're trying to get the Ukrainians to address serious issues of corruption and waste. But unfortunately, I don't think there are many countries in the EU right now that will support the American effort to find appropriate sanctions for what has happened in Crimea.
Meaning against Russia or
Against Russia, yes.
Yeah, I don't know how vulnerable Russia is to a lot of things, although having their stock market take a huge hit probably did not make a lot of people happy.
It's still an economy that's very much a commodity-based one. It's an economy that is dependent on their oil and gas resources. It's an economy that hasn't diversified, and that as much as the Russians talk about retaliating against any sanctions or efforts by the United States, the EU, or others, they continue to need the foreign currency that they gain from the export of their oil and gas. So it's, I don't like saying this, but it's a complicated situation. It's a situation where there are no easy answers. It's going to require the full force of American leadership. I mean, for me, this really is a defining moment for our country, for our government, to see how we react to this intervention into a sovereign country.
Now, I know there have been a lot of developments, concerns about natural gas, that Russia provides a lot of the natural gas for Europe, that it comes through pipelines through Ukraine. Certainly there's issues for Ukraine itself about natural gas. But I heard just today that the United States was talking about shipping liquefied natural gas. We've got other alternatives, potentially Azerbaijan maybe. What are you hearing about that?
Well, these are long-term solutions that don't adequately address the short-term needs of Ukraine and the rest of Europe. But it's important to try to address the short and long-term problems simultaneously. There are three major pipelines that run through Ukraine, from Russia through Ukraine to Europe. In anticipation of the ongoing political drama between Russia and Ukraine, many of the countries of Europe have stockpiled natural gas. There's also a lesson to be learned about diversifying energy sources of energy, and I believe that it is possible for the United States to export natural gas, but it's not something that's going to meet the immediate needs of these countries if there is a cutoff by Russia. But I don't think there will be, because again, if Russia cuts off the gas supplies, they cut off their funding sources. And Russia, like many other countries, have, over the last 5 years, has experienced a serious economic crisis, and they need these ongoing foreign reserves to continue to rebuild their economy.
Mark, how much of this is all due to Vladimir Putin and how much to other establishments within Russia itself?
Well, certainly President Putin is at the point, and everything flows through his office. And I think it's very clear that he's been in the forefront, in the lead, in trying to justify, explain what he wants to accomplish. We continue to misread his intentions. We continue to misread his decision-making process. What is happening today falls squarely on the shoulders of President Putin.
What are the challenges you see coming up in the near future? I mean, obviously there's certainly ones dealing with Russia, but what challenges do you see, I guess, for the Jewish community in Europe generally and in Eastern Europe specifically?
It's a very good question, and I think we have to watch carefully what's happening in Ukraine, because much of the world missed the rise of these far-right groups, particularly in Greece and Hungary. And they gained influence and power because people were looking for scapegoats for the serious economic difficulties that they were experiencing. And who is a more convenient scapegoat than Jews? And we at NCSJ are watching closely, not just in Ukraine, but in Russia and some of the other Slavic countries, to see if there's a corresponding growth and development of these far-right groups, and to see if there are any connections between the groups in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union and with Golden Dome and others in Western Europe. This is one of our major concerns. Secondly, is to ensure, not just in Ukraine, and I mentioned it before, but that Jewish institutions throughout Europe have the adequate security to avoid and not to live in fear that their institutions, their synagogues, community centers, hospitals will be vandalized, will be desecrated, that when congregants go to Shabbat services, they know that they won't have to worry about their safety coming or going. Third is what's happening with Israel and the relationships with many of these countries. You know, we haven't mentioned the BDS movement, and fortunately, it is not much of an issue in my part of the world or the countries that we focus on. But this is an increasingly difficult issue that needs to be addressed and hopefully can be contained. So these are just a few, but I don't want to sound so pessimistic because I really am an optimist. And I think the good news, or if there is any good news, is that Jews living in the former Soviet Union are continuing to try to build and grow their communities, and that they're trying to turn populations into real Jewish communities. And no matter what the size of the population is, there are efforts, you know, from a country like Azerbaijan that may have 15 to 30,000 Jews, to Ukraine that has hundreds of thousands of Jews. So we have very many serious challenges on the horizon, but there's also a reason to be optimistic.
Mark, to what extent is the Jewish community, for instance, Ukraine, dependent upon governmental entitlement programs, if there are any in that region?
Well, again, it depends on the segment of the population. I mean, one of the biggest challenges, not just for this interim government, but for previous governments in Ukraine, is to make their population understand that they have to be weaned off of government subsidies, especially in the energy area. Successive governments have been deathly afraid that if they impose the strong measures recommended by the IMF, the World Bank, the EU, that they would lose the next election, that their citizens wouldn't accept this tough medicine to solve their problems. So the government in Ukraine tries to provide for the most needy and the elderly, but that's why the work of JDC, World Order, the religious streams is so important, because they are trying to make up or to trying to fill the gap that the government can't.
When you contact the governments of these foreign countries, are they receptive to you? Or do you contact the ambassadors in Washington and other things? Are they willing to talk to you, or do they say, "Don't bother us"? No. How do they interact with you?
I mean, the short answer is yes, they are willing to sit down and talk, and most of the time they want to try to address our concerns. I think what makes us a credible organization is that we also listen to what their concerns are, and if we can be helpful to them while they're trying to address our concerns and to try to meet the needs of their Jewish citizens, it creates a strong relationship. I think, you know, the reason that we're able to do what the reason we're able to accomplish what we can today is because we've developed these relationships over the last 20 years. We're not new to them. They know who we are. They know what our concerns are. They know that we're a credible voice representing the organized American Jewish community. They know we're a credible voice with the U.S. government. So sometimes it makes it easier to raise difficult issues, because they also know that we're trying to help them gain a serious presence in Washington, and they know that we don't have an ulterior agenda.
So have you been involved in the negotiations yet? Dealing with crime.
We're always involved in negotiations. But we try. We try to be a productive voice. We try to be a reasonable voice. We're not looking to make political gain at the expense of these governments. What we're trying to do is to ensure the safety and well-being of the Jewish communities in these countries. We're trying to raise the issues that sometimes these communities can't raise themselves. We're trying to show these governments the value of having a strong relationship with the state of Israel and the United States, that there are benefits to this, and that that we can help strengthen this bond.
Mark, are you involved in any sort of inter-religious coalition on these issues?
Absolutely. We try to work very closely with, whether it's the Orthodox community, the Catholic church, the Catholic community. We have done, I'll give you a perfect example. On our visits to this region, we always meet with the religious leadership. When we were in Georgia, we met with the patriarch of the Georgian Orthodox Church. It's the equivalent of being the Georgian Pope. When we're in Azerbaijan or other Muslim countries, we try to meet with the Islamic leadership, because we're trying to build bonds, trying to create relationships. And in the United States, we try to do the same thing. I mean, one of the great successes of the Soviet Jewry movement in trying to get refuseniks out was creating a vast coalition that included every segment of the American religious community. And we succeeded in that. And we're continuing today to try to build these types of bonds.
When you're dealing with the Greek Orthodox Church, do you deal much with them in the United States on these issues? I mean, we haven't really had much interaction, I think, with our Greek Orthodox church here on this issue. We have a food fair. They have a food fair. We interact on that, but we haven't really talked about support of populations in Eastern Europe.
Well, again, it depends on the country. It depends on the makeup of that country's population. We've been fortunate to work with the different Orthodox churches. Now, interestingly, in the case of the Greek Orthodox community, there has been a greater outreach in the last few years between the American Jewish community and the Greek American community, including including the Orthodox Church, to try to build stronger bonds, to create a stronger relationship. And there was just a delegation of American Jewish leaders and Greek American leaders to Israel and Greece. So it can be done. It can be done.
Are there organizations that we can work with in the United States dealing with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or others like that, or is it primarily working through the Greek Orthodox Church? Because when I hear Orthodox, that's what I think of as the Greek Orthodox Church.
Well, no, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has a strong presence in the United States. We work with parts of the Ukrainian religious community. There are Ukrainian American groups that we work very closely with. I was just at a meeting yesterday of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation to talk about the current crisis. We try to be sensitive to their concerns about what's happening in their country, and I think we've been able to educate them to the concerns of the Jewish community in Ukraine, and they have tried to be advocates on their behalf. So I'm more than willing to try to make the shidduch.
Yeah, we'd be very happy to do that, especially if there are communities in Des Moines and Iowa. I don't know anything about it, basically. So I mean, that would be a very interesting conversation.
We'll have to find out. There's a strong Ukrainian presence in Chicago and in other parts of the Midwest. But we'll find out, and we'll talk and see what can be done.
Wonderful. Is there anything that you're working on right now, other than the crisis in Ukraine? Is there anything you're working on right now that you'd like to share with our audience?
Yes, I think again, I don't want to repeat everything I said before, but it's important for the audience at large, but especially the American Jewish community, to understand that there is a significant Jewish population. We are working very hard in many different countries. It just happens today that much of our attention is on Ukraine. But there are issues related to xenophobia, anti-Semitism throughout the region that needs our ongoing attention, and that the audience should know that, again, NCSJ engages in political advocacy so that our American relief organizations can do the work that they do in these countries to ensure a better and brighter future for the Jewish communities of the former Soviet Union. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you and to allow me to spend so much time with you talking about our agenda and the issues of the day.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Mark Levin, Executive Director of NCSJ, for joining us on Understanding the World this week. And we wish you all the best in your efforts, and we'll bring peace to Ukraine. How's that?
I couldn't say it any better. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Have a good week, and we'll see you later on next week on Understanding the World. Thank you for joining us today.
Get away from us, you mean old credit card. We don't have any more money. We're in trouble now. Save us! Help! Somebody save us! Somebody help! Help! Save us!
Hi, I'm Tom Coates from Consumer Credit of Des Moines. If your credit card's a little too animated, give us a call.
Hooray! We're saved! Consumer Credit, you're our hero!
All across America, there are countless numbers of people struggling with addiction and other life-controlling issues. Probably someone you know and love. There is a way out. There is hope. Transformations Treatment Center in Delray Beach, Florida, has a unique approach to substance abuse treatment. Call now and ask about our Guaranteed Success program, or log on to transformationstreatment.com. Transformations. Change your life. Change your relationships. Transform your world.
Hey, psst. Let me let you in on a little secret. You ready? Always try to do business with people, not places. Especially if you seek honest Christian business people. And when it comes to my car, I really need to trust who's working on it. Now, my family is so blessed. A few years ago, we found a family-owned automobile repair shop that operates as a Christian business also. Open, honest, reliable, trustworthy. It's AMCO on Hickman Road in front of Kmart. And it's a family-owned Christian operating business. This family treats your car as if it was their car. Everything from oil changes to transmission repair and everything in between. So the next time you feel the need to be at peace with your choice of who you can trust with your car, give AMCO on Hickman a chance to serve you. And tell them Max sent.